DSF Discover. That's our very brand new name. We were formerly DSF Online Learning. We're really glad that you're here. Welcome, everyone. Please type in the chat box where you are in the world, and maybe why you're here. We would love to know that so we can just learn more about you as we join in this together. I am so pleased to welcome Pastor Brandan Robertson. He is the lead pastor at Mission Gathering in San Diego and the author of True Inclusion, which you see behind him and right here on my desk. So tonight he's going to be talking to us about what is true inclusion, about the power of intersectionality, about empathic understanding, and challenges to becoming truly inclusive. We're going to save some time for Q&A. I want to encourage everyone to stick around to the very end. We have a few special offers for you, one at the beginning, one at the end. So we want to make sure you have the opportunity to take advantage of that. With that, I am just going to turn it right over to Brandan, and I'll stay on screen just for a minute or two, and then I'll exit out so you'll have the full screen.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us for our second webinar talking about this topic of true inclusion. And I'll dig into that in just a few seconds. But before, I want to let you know a little bit about who I am. Other than being the lead pastor, not sure what happened there.
I'm not either. I'm glad you're back. Okay, everyone, I'm Katie. This is Brandan. Let's do it again.
Cool. Other than being the lead pastor here at Mission Gathering, I've been doing this work of helping communities reconcile their desire to be inclusive with the practical, on-the-ground, necessary steps it takes to actually implementing those values. And particularly, I come from the evangelical church background, and it's in that background that I've done a lot of work walking those pastors both theologically and practically through the steps of inclusion, first around LGBT inclusion, but now more so around this topic we'll talk about later today, intersectionality, inclusion that is for all different people, all different kinds of people, all different marginalized groups. I went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and it was while I was there that I kind of had a deconstruction of faith, and I also had to come to reconcile my faith and my sexuality. And it was a difficult time in that environment, and I'm sure many of you on this webinar can relate to growing up in an environment that's a little bit more restrictive, a little bit more fundamentally exclusive in the way they view God and the world. And so it was after a long journey of trying to figure out what I really believed and what I really thought the heart of God was postured towards, that I ended up at a great place called Iliff School of Theology years later, and got to kind of reconstruct my theology, and also began discovering what is actually the theological heart of the book True Inclusion, that I believe the entire point of the Christian gospel, the entire message Jesus came to embody and to proclaim, is about the radical inclusive desire of God to bring all people in all different backgrounds, in every culture, in every class, every sexuality, and every gender identity into God's loving embrace. And so that's the undergirding of this book and of this seminar. And so kind of jumping in with that, I want to pose a couple rhetorical questions. Feel free to comment along as I'm speaking, by the way. But have you ever walked into a church that says all are welcome on the outside, but you know as soon as you walk in the door and you look around, clearly not all people are welcome, because that diversity that they proclaim on the welcome sign isn't reflected in the community? Or maybe you've walked into a church that touts itself as radically progressive and inclusive, but you have that same experience. You look around in the church, you look around at who makes up the church, and you realize that the people in the pews aren't reflective of the environment and the community around them. So their inclusion somewhere is falling short. Or maybe you walk into an LGBT inclusive church, one that has rainbow flags flying out front, but as soon as you walk in the door, you realize that inclusive for this community simply stops at LGBT inclusion. And it disregards women in ministry, or it disregards people of color, or the plight of various oppressed groups in the community. See, the reality is inclusion is a tricky concept. especially when we begin to talk about inclusion in the religious context. Inclusion has become one of the most important words in marketing for faith communities today. It's a badge of honor, and almost every faith community wants to use the word and be known as someone and as a community that's inclusive. Yet my experience is that while most churches and most leaders want to tout the word inclusion, very few communities are actually working towards what I call true inclusion. For most communities, to be inclusive means that they include one minority group. You could be committed as a church to racial justice, which means that you're spending lots of time and energy trying to make sure that the racial inequities in your community are addressed. Or your church might be focused on women in ministry, and that's kind of your big fighting point. Or maybe it is LGBT inclusion that your church is all about. All of those things are amazing. All of those things are really important and necessary, and they represent progress. But any church or organization that embraces one outreach of inclusion to the exclusion of others is failing to understand what it truly means to be inclusive. They seem to understand the basic premise of what inclusion is all about. When I was first asked by Chalice Press to write this book, True Inclusion, they came to me and said, "Brandon, you've been talking publicly about LGBT inclusion for a while now, and lots of churches are becoming LGBT inclusive. But the question most people are asking now is, now that we've crossed this hurdle, what's next?" Initially, I loved the idea of writing about this concept, and I had already spent, like I said, years working with denominations and church leaders to lead them through the process of inclusion. And I myself was wondering, what's next? How do we continue this message? But as I sat down to write True Inclusion, especially in the social, political, cultural climate of 2017, my convictions and my ideas about inclusivity began to change. I began to be gravely concerned how many churches and individuals who I had watched and even led through the process of becoming LGBT inclusive failed to racial minorities. They failed to participate in things like Black Lives Matter or the Women's March or Me Too or the immigration debate. For far too many communities and far too many individuals, we were too concerned with patting ourselves on the back for crossing the line and becoming inclusive of the LGBT community, but we weren't really willing to take inclusion to its logical conclusion and fight for a robust understanding of justice for everyone. Even today, so many of our progressive Christian organizations and churches carry banners of justice that fail to take justice and inclusion to its logical conclusion. What I became convinced of as I watched our culture and as I looked again at the prophetic words of Jesus in the Gospels was that there was no room in the Christian faith for half-hearted inclusion. There was no incremental path to become inclusive. There was no safe trajectory to be inclusive and to bring people into the loving embrace of God. It occurred to me that you either had to be all in for inclusion, or your inclusion was probably more a marketing scheme than it was a deep conviction rooted in the prophetic ministry of Jesus. Those might be harsh words, but through the process of writing the book and through the process of stepping into ministry of my own inclusive church, I discovered that this path towards speaking and teaching and molding inclusive communities can be prickly and uncomfortable. But it's exactly what I believe Jesus is calling us to, and it's exactly what I believe our world needs to see from the church most today. Communities that jump full headfirst into radical inclusion. So what I want to do first is I'm going to jump in, and there's about 4 parts to this seminar. And this first part, I'm going to explain what I mean when I say true inclusion. I want to remind you that you can chat in the chat box, write any questions or comments, and we will be able to interact with them at the end of each of these little sections. So if you have any questions, begin sending them our way, and let's jump in to part 1. What is true inclusion?
Cool. And Brandon, right as you're doing that, we have a few comments of people who have also had that kind of like bait and switch experience.
Yeah.
Too. So I want to affirm everyone who's writing those in. And this might be a really good point. I'm just going to put something on the screen for everyone. If you have not had the chance to read Brandon's book yet, Chalice has really generously given us a 30% discount. And so you can just add that directly to your cart. It'll take you to the Chalice website. Continue to stay on here and listen to the presentation. But that'll be there for you as we move forward together. So I'll leave that up for about a minute so you can click on the link and then we'll go ahead and continue. Thank you.
Cool. So what do I mean when I talk about true inclusion? What do I mean when I talk about creating communities of radical embrace? What does it mean to follow in this radically inclusive path of Jesus? I begin these conversations always by zooming out beyond our theological or religious arguments to understand the importance of inclusion from a psychological and a sociological perspective. I'm sure you all know the psychotherapist and researcher Brené Brown, and she wrote that a deep sense of belonging and love is an irreducible need of all people. We are biologically, cognitively, spiritually, physically wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. When those needs are not met, we don't function as we're meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, we get sick. This sentiment has been echoed both by psychotherapists and researchers and spiritual writers for centuries. From the earliest pages of the Hebrew Bible, we're told that God did not want humans to be alone. Belonging and relationship are irreducible needs of all people. It follows then that when we're forced to the margins as people, when we're forced out of communities of relationship, that creates deep trauma. When we do that, we're creating and perpetuating great harm to the people that we're excluding. When we exclude people from relationship and from community, biblically, we're chipping away at their fundamental humanity because, again, God said humans are not meant to be alone. And the psychological data supports this. Consistently, those who are rejected from their schools or their families or their churches and are marginalized because of aspects of their identity, they have higher rates of suicidal ideation and mental illness and depression. We know that those who are rejected and excluded and disregarded, they're at higher rates and risk of drug addiction and homelessness and physical illness even. We know that this is true. Study after study confirms this, that exclusion objectively harms people. There is no room to debate about that. And not only does exclusion create tangible psychological and physical harm to those that are excluded, but it also harms those of us who fail to benefit from the experience and perspectives of the very people we've excluded. True inclusion demands that we recognize that only in our great diversity do we our Creator. Whenever we're compelled to declare that someone doesn't belong, whether it's because of their sexuality or ethnicity or background or beliefs, whether it's because of their disruptiveness or their neediness or their inconveniencing of us, we're entering into a process of dehumanization, both of ourselves and the person that we're excluding. And this is an assault, again, on the very imago Dei, the image and likeness of God in our world. We're attempting in our excluding to cut off a unique part of someone's incarnation and manifestation of the beauty of God, simply because we don't agree or we don't understand or we don't feel comfortable with this aspect of whatever person or persons we're excluding. But our discomfort, your discomfort, it's never an excuse to marginalize or to exclude. And if we do justify our exclusion, we need to be held accountable for the tangible, verifiable harm that we're doing. This is something most churches don't actually get, but for those of us who have had exclusion as part of the heart of our communities in the past, We need to own up to the harm that we've actually done. And it's not just some ethereal spiritual harm that hurts some people's feelings. It's tangible harm done to tangible people. And our churches and our denominations and our organizations need to own up to that. We must speak up, and we must declare that those who exclude are engaging in something that causes literal harm to actual people. And we need to show them the impact of that. Because most people perpetuating exclusion are not fundamentally bad people, but they don't understand the impact of what they're doing. Exclusion isn't a matter of differing ideologies. It's a spiritual and social and psychological version of abuse. That's when we shift to the gospel of Christ. When we begin to see that the gospel compels us to get rid of exclusion in our hearts and in our communities and in our world. It takes only some time to read through the gospel accounts of Jesus, and you'll begin to see very quickly that Jesus is always calling out those who perpetuate exclusion and is proclaiming a message of radical inclusion from the earliest part of his ministry to the very end. The message and the mission of Jesus center around a radical, robust, and inconvenient message. A message that says all people, regardless of their religious convictions or political affiliations, ethnic identities, sexualities, or gender identities, are worthy of God's love. Jesus consistently and unambiguously launches an assault on the systems in his day that sought to oppress others, the systems that privilege some and marginalize many. He declared a theological and a political message that in God's ordering of things, all people have an equal seat at God's table. In God's ordering of the world, mountains are made low and valleys are exalted. The mighty are humbled and the humbled are raised up. If this message of the gospel is true, then our world must necessarily be transformed. A death must occur, a death of our egoic self, of our fleshly desires, of our discriminatory behavior, which prefers to uplift those who have the same kind of flesh as us. We must put to death that fleshly carnal self that Paul writes about. That's where our divisiveness comes from. And we must realize that at our core, we are all participants in the same spirit, in the same light, and in the same life. We must sacrifice our own comfort and privilege and power. We must all lay our lives on the altar of sacrifice, not to appease an angry God, but to demonstrate to our neighbors that they are fully loved and that we will not live for our own self-interest, but we're living for the good, for the healing, for the redemption of the world. To make this sacrifice, it requires faith. Faith that the Spirit of God is actually at work in the world, is actually moving humanity to a higher level of being. And when we sacrifice our own privilege, it takes faith to believe that we're not going to be betrayed by those around us and find ourselves at the bottom of some oppressive system. That's a fear that so many people with privilege and power hear as they begin this process of becoming radically inclusive. The fear that by giving up their own privilege and power, that they're going to somehow be oppressed. History shows us, however, that more often than not, those who waken to this message that's at the heart of the gospel, this way of seeing and being in the world, they're going to face some pushback from the countercultural movements that seek to uphold privilege and power and exclusivity. You might actually face some persecution of your own, because to become truly inclusive, it costs something. This isn't an easy path to follow. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what exactly the cost looks like. But it's the path of faithfulness to God. It's the path of faithfulness to Jesus' vision and desire for the church and the world. This is why Jesus said the path is narrow and few find it. The path of following Christ to create a just world is not easy. But if we lean into it, I believe we will create the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. the world that Jesus called the kingdom of God. Our sacrifice is worth it. The sacrifice of your faith community is worth it. The sacrifice of your organization is worth it to reverse the harm that's being done and to embrace the posture of God, which is, as the Old Testament prophet wrote, arms outstretched all the day long to a disobedient people. That's the image of our God, always willing to embrace even those who are not willing to embrace him. And that's the call at the heart of the gospel, that we seek to ensure that everyone has an equal place at the table of grace. And so this is what I mean when I talk about true inclusion from a 50,000-foot level. And now I want to check in and see so far if we have any questions or comments related to this content.
We've had a few comments coming in. I asked if anyone, the sort of fear factor affected anyone else, and raised my hand. Yeah, and so Bonnie responded, that fear of being really uncomfortable. So I can definitely identify with that. And I'd be curious if anyone else has anything particular that they want to comment on or ask questions. This is a good time to do that. And I know it takes a minute or two to get the comments in the chat box, so I can pipe back up whenever those appear.
Cool. Well, I do appreciate those of you that are willing to lean into the discomfort. And I'll just resonate with that, by the way, that it is uncomfortable to, as a pastor, I'm learning to create inclusive community and to practice what I'm preaching, because it brings together people who otherwise wouldn't normally be together in some common space. But that's how growth happens and healing happens in culture and in our lives.
Yes, a couple more came in. So the fear that other people changing will make me have to react and change again. So I'm pretty sure everyone on the face of the planet can resonate with that, but I love the way that you've articulated that, the person that articulated that. Yeah. And then another one, there's literal cost to being fully inclusive. Our church wants to welcome those with physical handicaps, but the 155-year-old building is not ADA compliant, no automatic doors, no elevators. And so, yeah, those are real and perceived barriers.
Yeah. Totally. And like I said, we're going to jump into that a little bit more later, but I appreciate those thoughts because, again, inclusion, it's about sacrifice, and it means sacrifice for our communities and sacrifice of ourselves. And so for part two, I'm going to keep leaning into these comments and this idea that we're talking about. I already love how we're not in the chats just talking about LGBT inclusion. We're already talking about all the different kinds of people that need to be included in our faith communities. Which brings us to part two, where we talk about the concept of intersectionality. Now that I've summed up what I mean about true inclusion, I want to state kind of the principles of the concept of true inclusion. And this first one is that if our inclusion is going to embody the way of Jesus, it must, first and foremost, be intersectional. The Black feminist scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw first coined the term intersectionality in 1980 to describe her observation that race and gender justice were fundamentally linked together, and that if we tried to achieve racial justice or gender justice on their own, we would ultimately fall short at achieving both. The example that Crenshaw used was she looked at the case of Anita Hill, who was an African-American attorney in 1991 who accused her boss, Clarence Thomas, of sexual assault. As Hill made her case, two opposing groups gathered together to support her. The first group that was supporting Anita Hill was those who supported women's rights, and the other group were those supporting her rights as a person of color. In the end, Kimberly Crenshaw Williams argues, Hill was forced to suppress her experience as a woman of color in favor of just identifying her case with women's rights. According to Crenshaw's analysis, Anita Hill's experience of sexual assault was both a result of racism and sexism, not one or the other. But in the public consciousness of the time, she was forced to choose one of the issues to address her sexual assault and her firing. See, in the oppressive system of patriarchy, which I argue in True Inclusion, is the singular system that is the cause of all oppression in our churches and society today, patriarchy stands upon the pillars of racial oppression and gender oppression and sexual oppression and class oppression. And unless we see all of those things as inextricably linked, we can't take down this whole pillar of patriarchal oppression that needs to be destroyed for inclusion to be birthed. To understand the oppression of any one group, one has to look at how the forces of oppression affect all of the identities connected to any one issue. To address only one facet of identity fails to understand how oppression actually manifests in society. Thus, when Anita Hill became a figure for women's rights, the general public ignored her experience that was unique as an African American woman, an experience that differs greatly from that of white women. Similarly, this is why the most oppressed people in our society today are trans women of color, who embody every layer of patriarchal oppression. In order to seek liberation for them, it's clearly not adequate to simply address either racial justice or gender justice or sexual minority justice. No, all of these things are linked together as part of that one person's identity. And any approach that doesn't seek to liberate all aspects of that one person's identity will never ultimately liberate that person. To be truly inclusive is to work to understand the intersectional identities of individuals, and then to work to create communities and ultimately to create a society where we're liberated in every facet of our identities. The goal of becoming inclusive is not to become a more interesting or bigger church, but instead, the goal of inclusion is the salvation and liberation of every single aspect of all of our identities. Because when we're all liberated to be the people who God created us to be, our world and our churches and our lives are better for it. To be inclusive is to seek salvation and redemption for the world through the liberation and the salvation of the individual. To do so, we must understand the ways that oppressive structures are seeking to I'll say that again. We must understand the ways that the very oppressive structures that we're seeking to dismantle are functioning at the intersection of multiple identities. This means that we have to take an intersectional approach to inclusive justice. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with pastors who are having some conversation in their faith community about a controversial topic, say women in ministry. And eventually I ask, okay, great. That's really amazing that you're dealing with the issue of sexism in the church, but how are you thinking about racial injustice in your community? And the pastors usually respond by saying something like, race isn't really our issue. That's not what we're called to around here, or that's not what we can focus on right now. We can only handle one issue at a time. All of those responses, though, fundamentally misunderstand the problem that they're trying to address. And therefore, they'll inevitably fail and falter in their attempts to become more inclusive. If your church is just willing to focus on gender equality, if you're willing to focus on giving women equal roles in your church, then you must also begin to address racism and classism and ableism and LGBT inequality, because all of these things are connected. The theology that we use to shift our belief in one area of patriarchal inclusion, whether it's women in ministry or gender justice or LGBT inclusion, is the same theology that we need to shift the way we believe and think about all other areas of inclusion in our faith. Because again, the issue isn't just racism or sexism or classism or homophobia. Each of those is a pillar of a larger, more oppressive system. Jesus came to liberate us all from the full weight of patriarchy. And therefore, if we're going to be an inclusive community, we've got to commit to attacking that whole system at the same time. In order to practice intersectional inclusivity, we've got to humble ourselves. We've got to be willing to listen to the voices of the marginalized within and outside of our church community. We must be willing to repent of the harm that we've done. We must be willing to change our traditions and our practices and our beliefs and our buildings, as we've already heard, to reflect the radically inclusive heart of our Creator, no matter what the cost is to us. So that's what I mean when we're talking about intersectional inclusion. And I'm interested to see if anybody else has any comments or questions on that part of this presentation.
A few comments coming in. I asked for how many people is intersectionality a new concept, and it might not be a new concept, but it might be a new word, or vice versa. It's a word that gets that's beginning to catch on and doesn't always get defined. Someone responded that intersectionality in the context of church is really new, and for others it's not so new, and so we have people on all parts of the spectrum. We do have a question. Can any of the issues get the attention that we need to give them when we divvy up our energy and attention across a broad spectrum of issues at one time? So if I'm understanding that question right, it's can we do them all at once, or do we need to break them down? Yeah, that's a great question that we can entertain later on too.
Yeah, totally. And I think I'll give a brief answer now, and then we'll come back to it later. But again, I think the way we need to be thinking about this is that inclusion is a all-encompassing concept. And the problem that we're addressing isn't racism or classism or homophobia. It's patriarchy. It's a larger system of oppression in and of itself. And so we need to be asking ourselves individually and as communities constantly, what is the message that we're preaching? What is the way that we're believing? What are the policies that we're enacting that are perpetuating the spirit of inclusion, or spirit of exclusion, I should say, regardless of who it's applying to? Anywhere that your church is excluding anyone, that should be the conversation that we're trying to address. I think it gets a little problematic when we try to say we're just going to focus on racial justice, or we're just going to focus on gender justice. We should instead say, let's just focus on holistic justice or holistic inclusion. And again, it's easier said than done, but it's an important process that I think we should all be seeking to lean into.
So is one of the practicalities kind of moving to where the energy is? I'm kind of curious, is one of the practicalities moving to like where the energy is? Like if people are having, if a lot of people are noticing, gosh, there's this gap in our community right now, then that's something to pay attention to. That doesn't mean you're excluding something. It means that's where you're putting your energy for that day even, or that hour. Totally.
And I would just, the only caution there, I think, yes, that's amazing. And again, a lot of us churches, I mean, it's easy for us to have and I don't mean to degrade it in this way by calling it this, but like a pet project. Right. And so lots of energy can go in one place, and it's just hard sometimes when you get really involved in one particular community to want to spread your energy elsewhere. And I just think the challenge is to keep remembering, there's more people that we're not ministering to that need to be included. So,
Yeah, just a few other comments. Someone's been working on I'm not going to say it right, intergenerationality, whatever it is, in our church. And that's also intersectional. That's great. And okay, Pam, I'm trying. I know that your fingers were tapping too fast. You attended a talk in 2018 at a UCC church, but I'm not quite sure. Type it again, and then we'll get it in the next go round. Brandon, we somehow can't hear you.
How about now?
There we go. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Pam, keep typing and we'll pick up your question in the end of part 3. And so we've talked about what true inclusion is. We've talked about intersectionality. And now I'm hearing my Are we good? Cool. And so the third thing that I want to talk about, the third kind of key principle in the heart of true inclusion, is that of empathic understanding. A few years ago, while I was consulting a group of evangelical pastors on how they could help move their churches in the inclusion of LGBT people, we came to the realization that forever changed the way that I do this work. And it's not going to be groundbreaking for many of you on this webinar, but it was for me at the time. And it's that it's only through hearing stories and through hearing the struggles and the incarnated experience of LGBT people, and it's only through doing the hard work of sitting down and being with people on the margins, that we can begin to both empathize and understand the pain of our non-affirming theology and practice on them. Again, this probably isn't groundbreaking to most of you, but this core principle in that statement is what I call empathic understanding. And it's not a one-time action, but it's an ongoing posture of life, again, modeled on the person of Jesus himself. The incarnation is the most profound model of empathic understanding, I believe, in the world. Because in the person of Jesus, the Christian tradition teaches God stepped into the human experience. God didn't just listen to the plights of humans, but God stood in our midst as one of us. God experienced what it was like to be human, to walk alongside of humanity. God discovered what the world was like in our shoes. Similarly, when I talk about empathic understanding, I'm talking about doing the hard work of moving outside the walls of our churches and our inner communities and our own homes and lives, and moving into spaces where we don't frequent that often. Empathic understanding is something that doesn't happen to us naturally, because it causes us to get uncomfortable, to move outside of our comfort zones. And in order to do it, it can't just be like a one-time mission trip where you parachute into somewhere and have a cultural experience and leave. It's a posture of life and living. Jesus understood this, that true and lasting change only comes in proximity to the people who are marginalized and excluded. And Jesus showed us that that kind of change only happens when we enter into relationship and we begin to understand at a deep level what others are experiencing. If you walk into any denominational office of any group of Christians in North America, you're more than likely going to stumble into church conversations about how we can grow more churches, how we can attract more people, how we can get bigger buildings, and ultimately get more money for our institutions. But very few institutions are having a conversation about how we can better do life in our actual communities and neighborhoods, beyond the walls of our institutions and our churches. Very few institutions are thinking about ways that we can open up our properties and our resources and use them to become a hub in which our local community can use our space and maximize it, rather than focusing on the church, how the church can use it for its own benefit. Yet Jesus never stayed in the place of power. Instead, he always helped people enter into abundant life wherever they were at. Whereas most of institutional religion has always had a desire to create conformity to an institution most of the time, Jesus demanded that we reject conformity, and he met people where they were, how they were. What if our faith communities were to become touch points, places where folks can come to learn, to provoke one another, to organize, and then we intentionally pushed people out, away from the institution, away from their own comfort, to tend to the needs and the desires and the interest of our community, beyond the faith community? What if our local community sought to uplift and empower other local leaders to live into their dreams and callings? What if we stopped focusing on ourselves and instead began using our resources to host events and programs for our community and for the marginalized groups in our community that need it more than our institutionalized church does? And what if those people who were connected to our faith community learned to support and participate in the work of others outside of our community, instead of needing to own everything and to put our branding on everything? I think what would emerge is a deep understanding of empathic posturing in the world. Because we begin to see that it's not about inviting people so we can grow our churches, but instead it's about inviting people, our churches, to go out and to learn and to listen, not just to benefit the marginalized, but so that the marginalized people can benefit us and make our lives and our faith richer and deeper. If we began to embrace empathic understanding as the core principle of our ministry and our life, it would give us the opportunity to see our world from another's perspective. And it would model the example of Jesus, who infused his vision for the kingdom of God into everything that he did. Whether it was joining immoral people for a dinner party, or discussing spirituality with peasants on a mountainside, or even occasionally entering the institution with the objective of stirring things up. Through Jesus' constant contact with diverse people, his own perspective was refined and shaped. Such growth only occurs through contact with those who we see as our others. If we're going to become communities of empathic understanding, we must spend most of our energy, and I want you to hear that, most of our energy out in the world, not seeking to entice people to join our community. On a practical note, I want to hammer a point home. True inclusion and becoming a deeply intersectional, a deeply empathic community is not going to initially grow your church. If you embrace this path, it's actually likely going to cost you some people, because people like comfort. People don't want to be in communities that are constantly challenging them to step outside of themselves and their comfort zone to grow. At Mission Gathering, this is a constant struggle for us. The more we lean into true inclusion, the more we push away those who just want a country club where they can come and relax and be comforted. But that's not what our Christian faith calls us to. And if we're going to be radical disciples of Jesus, we've got to be willing to give up our own size and numbers for the pursuit of being the channels of God's justice and healing and inclusion in our world. And also, as you become truly inclusive, you're going to begin attracting people from the margins. And when people from the margins come, they're going to come with pain and hurt. And so your community is going to become a primary place of healing, of redemption, of reconciliation. And many people who come to your community because it's inclusive, who have been marginalized or hurt by the church, are going to enter into your community simply as a waypoint on their journey, not as the destination. Our churches need to become a place of healing, a place where people can rediscover faith. But sometimes, I would actually say often, the people who come in from the margins and experience healing in our community, they might move on. We need our churches not to be about institutions or buildings, but about being a place that offers redemption and justice to absolutely everyone who needs it. We need to be not ashamed of creating small communities that are dedicated to radical inclusion, because I believe small communities that are centered on these values can have more impact on their community than the megachurch. Truly inclusive communities begin to redefine success, not by Sunday service attendance or those who have entered into discipleship process. Instead, they start to measure their success, their impact by the people who are showing up in various activities that their community is helping to host throughout the week. The people that are showing up to ministries and outreaches and opportunities for growth that might not be Sunday worship. It's about becoming hubs in which the inclusive justice and love of God are manifested in various ways that might not look like hearing a preacher sing on, some of you preachers might sing, but I mean hearing a preacher preach on Sunday morning. And that's bad news for those of us who love preaching and want to make it about teaching and all of that. And that's still good, and there's a place for that. But I think as we enter into this inclusive way of being as a church, we need to shift again what we're all about, how we view our mission, to be not just a gathering on Sunday mornings, but to be a more holistic hub of outreach, of true discipleship, of healing. And when we begin to do that, I think we're actually, like I said, going to impact more lives in a more profound way than our community ever had the capability to do before. And so with that, I'm going to cut it off there for a second, and I want to check in and see if there are any more thoughts or questions.
Yeah, this is the time for everyone. You can go ahead and type them in. And I asked, does the sort of idea that you may lose church members strike fear in the hearts of many here? Because that's certainly very reasonable. And yeah, so someone responded that, yeah, you may lose church members, be rejected, and that's a scary part of the sacrifice. And yeah, definitely. And I want to circle back around to Pam. Thank you for retyping in your comment. Back to intersectionality. I attended a talk in 2018 at a UCC event that was led, and that's United Church of Christ, that was led by a credible person, gay, Black, female, that felt very intersectional.
Yeah, that's
the
awesome.
embodiment of that leader. Yeah. So if other people have kind of questions about this part on smaller communities doing this kind of justice work and doing this missional work, go ahead and type them in. But yeah, someone typed in that kingdom building is sacrificial.
Yeah.
So I will broadcast that for us for a moment.
Yeah. And again, I think I agree with all of this. I think that really, again, we need to enter into an era where churches, faith communities, even organizations begin to redefine our metrics. Because, like I said, I think at Mission Gathering, as a practically being a pastor here, of course, I would love to speak to 1,000 people on Sunday morning. But what I've discovered is that our community here of 120 people, by really engaging and working to do what I've been saying, going into places in our community, volunteering, reaching out, being a voice for justice where it hasn't been represented from faith communities before, I'm seeing our community actually have more impact than a lot of the churches in our neighborhood that have 3 times as many people. And that we don't have a budget for any of this. It's not, we're not doing this because of piles of money. It's simply because when you get a bunch of people that are really dedicated to doing the work of inclusion and justice, that catches on. It really does. And we're also in a cultural moment where the eyes of the world are looking for the people that are willing to speak up, speak truth to power. This is a great moment for churches to begin leaning and embracing this radical inclusion and also expanding our impact. And as a progressive church leader, I'd like to see our progressive churches get out of our stuffy pews and do this a little bit more, because we can really reclaim some ground in the country.
Awesome. And we've got, we'll have some more practical options for people too, that we'll be giving in a little bit. So 2 questions came in. The first, can you talk more about how we can work in an intersectional way to become open to people of all races, abilities, sexual identity, et cetera, at the same time?
Yeah. So my favorite part of the book, and we'll actually just jump into this part, is the ending of the book where I have an appendix and I give some practical suggestions. And one of the things I suggest is, the first thing actually, is to participate in regular community self-assessments and create an inclusion task force. What I mean by that is, there's a church in Chicago I actually kind of ripped this from. It's an urban village church in Chicago, a United Methodist congregation. And they, a few years ago, started this practice of bringing in outside people to come and do consulting and do an assessment of their congregation to see how they were dealing with racism and homophobia and xenophobia and all the other areas that churches tend to fall short in. And this external source was then able to kind of say, look, these are the areas where your blind spots are at, and you need to figure out how to intentionally begin engaging these areas of bias or prejudice. So I think it's really good to have some folks come in. You don't, again, need to hire somebody necessarily, but I just think to invite other clergy perhaps to come into your church for a Sunday or spend a week with you or whatever, and just look at your culture, look at your church and see who are the people you're not addressing, who are the people you're not including. And as you see those different people groups that you're excluding, I really think that, again, the way you're going to address including them is all going to be quite similar. The way you include LGBT people is the same way that you include women. It's the same way that you include people of color and people with disabilities and different abilities. They might have practical manifestations that look a little bit different, but I just think regular self-assessment, identifying blind spots, and then as a congregation and as a team of leaders, continually thinking, okay, so we're doing really bad this year on racial justice. Our church is becoming unicultural. How are we going to lean into becoming a more inclusive community that engages people of different cultures and colors and classes? And so it's a both and. I hear it's engaging one issue at a time while also trying to engage the multiplicity of groups. And I think it's that tension back and forth and balance.
Cool, thank you. And someone else asked, how do I respond to people in the church who are against inclusion and don't follow Jesus' command to love your neighbor? And I'm going to obviously turn this over to Brandon, but Pam, I want to encourage you to also email me, because DSF Discover is working on exactly that question in a focused way as well as in the true inclusion with Brandon.
Yeah, honestly, and I don't mean to sound harsh here, but I think that if the church decides to embrace radical inclusion, if that becomes something that's said from the pulpit all the way down to the lowest volunteer level, whatever that is, it's going to begin to make those people who aren't interested in it uncomfortable. And they're either going to have to repent, not to use a traditional word, but I do think it's going to cause them to either into a place of self-reflection where they're going to have to own up to their own biases and prejudices, or they're going to leave. And again, that's what I mean. When churches really take up this call, I've seen it time and time again. A bunch of people leave right away because they have all sorts of excuses, like the church is just becoming a social justice church or whatever. But I think that's kind of what Jesus talked about. He said it would happen. He said that there would be this separation of those who are about the things of the kingdom and those who are not. And that doesn't mean those people who leave are gone forever or are bad people. We all know that the journey to become inclusive and to confront our own prejudice and bias takes time and is a process. And so I just think churches need to go ahead and help move the congregation into a posture of becoming inclusive. And as you do that, people will self-select whether they want to continue to be a part of what the community is doing.
Great. And there's a couple of other comments. I think we have time for one more, which is someone really loved the idea of the bias workshop, but getting people there seems like a problem. And if I can speak to that, just like one, I haven't done a bias workshop in exactly the way that Brandon was talking about, but one way to do that is to have your best friend who's not a church member or even not a Christian come and observe, because they are going to see things that we are blinded to see, and they're going to name insider language that you're using that they don't understand. They'll tell you what that is. They'll tell you who's not there that they expected to be there. So that's not even a formal workshop, but a great way just to get an outsider's perspective on what's happening. Yeah.
And I agree. I think that's a cheap and easy way to do it. And I also, it's not necessarily a workshop. This is primarily, it's kind of that same thing. There are organizations and groups that will come in and observe your church and then offer the church, the entire church, not just the staff, an assessment, and everybody will see it. And it reveals if your church has a heart of, or a root of racism still left in it, it'll say it. And again, I kind of lay this out a little bit more, but it's a way for us to kind of have a mirror held up to our communities. And again, it's a painful process. It's not a fun process. But it's necessary, because if we're really committed to this radical inclusion, we have to be willing to own our own stuff. And with like the 60 seconds I have left, I'm going to just read off the other few suggestions and leave you all with them. 10 suggestions to make true inclusion real in your context. 1, participate in community self-assessment. 2, give the voiceless back their voice. What that means is don't speak on behalf of the marginalized communities, but allow the marginalized people to speak for themselves. That's a key thing that most churches totally are blind to do as they're seeking to be good allies. 3, do your own research. Marginalized people, it's not their job or calling to educate you. A lot of times it takes a lot of work to relive trauma and hash it out and tell you our stories. So go. There are books and resources. Read up, study, learn about racism, homophobia, ableism. 4, never build a platform on the advocacy on others' stories. This happens a lot. A lot of well-meaning allies get really fired up and then make LGBT inclusion their thing. I don't think that's helpful. It's taking away from the voices of the actual people who deserve to have the voice. So it kind of goes back to give the voiceless back their voice. 5, show up to serve, be in a posture of service, not of being the leader and the owner of events and space and all sorts of things. 6, intentionally deconstruct patriarchy and reconstruct inclusivity. Kind of talked all about that. 7, put your money where your activism is, invest resources in this process. 8, repent often and repent publicly. Again, it's hard, but it's necessary. 9, don't be a community of response, but of consistent advocacy. Don't wait until the next queer person of color is killed to speak about it. Be doing this throughout the year. Be doing this Sunday after Sunday. And 10, again, engage in community-wide trainings, discussions, and studies. Engage your whole church in the process of reading a book by a queer person of color or a differently abled person, and cultivate conversations around it. So those were lightning round, quick, but I just wanted to leave you all with them, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. I love that. I love the top 10, and that's something that we would actually love to have the opportunity to explore more with people. It's going to publish right now. Brandan has been gracious enough to actually offer to do a course with us with DSF Discover. And that will take place May 19th through 23rd. And it's at a very low tuition right now, $37 for 5 hours. So this is a high level of mentoring that people will receive. And I imagine that we'll be able to go through those not the top 10 list, but the 10 points that you just made in greater detail. You get to go through the book. You don't have to have the book to participate, but that's always an option for you. Yeah, so Brandan, what else can you envision for those conversations that we might be having together? Some more practical, hands-on, and theoretical, and
yeah, I think that's pretty much I think that's it. It's that a lot of this is just quick flyby of the knowledge. I think in those, I'm just going to kind of hash out the concepts in a little bit more of a theoretical way, and then ask us to engage more actively around the conversations of what it looks like in our individual cultures and contexts. And so I hope it's a helpful course for church leaders and for even individuals who just want to be an agent of change in their community. So I'm excited to do it.
Yeah, we're really excited too. And yeah, so let me emphasize that this is great for people who are in particular congregations. But I know we get a lot of watchers too who are a little bit fearful about stepping back into a congregation, which we get it. And so I think this might still be valuable for you and give you the tools you need to find the congregation that would be the best fit for you, to keep your eyes open for those kind of communities that are doing this kind of work.
Yes.
Yes, we'd still love to have you. That's church membership is not a prerequisite.
Absolutely.
Great. So that is there. People feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have questions about that. I'm Kay Valentine, just like the holiday, Kay Valentine at dsf.edu. And I can pass any questions along to Brandan, or if it's nuts and bolts, then I'm happy to answer those. Brandan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. Let me check and make sure. People are writing in with their thanks, and someone is hosting a small group around your book.
Oh,
nice.
That's so cool. You should reach out, and I would love to either Skype in or something like that. That would be awesome.
Oh, that would be really fun. Yeah. So feel free to email me or Brandan directly, but you have my email, and so I can help connect the two of you. Yeah, so some people are saying they would love to engage further and get others in your church group involved. So if you have several members who you can envision like this, like you would all like to gather and kind of do this together or work through this together, let me know, because we can work out congregational rates. So definitely email me. I can't organize that on our platform, but we can work on that individually. So let me know that. And I also want to tell you, let everyone know that if you're not available every single night, May 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, that's okay, because we'll actually record everything and we'll upload it and you'll have access to everything. I don't know anyone these days who has a free evening every single night of the week, except for Brandan and I, who have set aside this time. And so we're not actually expecting that. And you can still engage even without being live with us, and you'll still have all the access and email access and all of that with us. Perfect. All right. I think that's it for the evening. Thank you so much. Prayers, blessings to everyone. Thanks for being with us. And thanks for all your work.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone. Bye.